Today's scripture has one of the more puzzling sayings in all of the Gospels. Pick up your cross and follow me. Take up your cross and follow me. What can that mean? Well, for Jesus, we tend to interpret it literally. He knows that he is going to end up on a cross in Jerusalem. So when he says, I've got a cross that's waiting for me, I think we understand what he means about that. But when he says to his disciples, you have to be ready to take your cross and bring it with you, what is he talking about? Not all of his disciples would end up crucified, so we're not expected to interpret this literally. And what does it mean for us, who, thankfully, will never end up anywhere near a cross? So what do these strange words mean? Well, crosses are hard and unforgiving. They don't bend, and you can't negotiate with a cross. They're heavy, and it hurts to carry them. In short, they're the last thing you would ever want to deal with. If someone says, pick up a cross, most of us just want to head in the other direction. And if you're avoiding a cross in your life, it can come in many forms. It can be a problem that you can't fix. A relationship that's just not working and you don't want to deal with it. So you just keep putting it off and pretend like it's okay. It can be a mistake in the past that you've made that you just don't want to face up to and you don't want anyone else to know about either. So you put it off and you head in the other way. It can just be a part of yourself that you don't like very much and you desperately want to deny. Crosses come in all sorts of shapes and forms, and most of the time we don't want to deal with them. That's what makes them crosses. Rather than carry them, we try to get as far away as possible as we can. We head in the other direction. But that just leaves the cross where it is, not gone, but just waiting. We tend to think of these crosses as individual ones, but crosses can also be collective. Over the last few months, a new type of protest has started in Europe. It started in September in Sweden and slowly moved through Europe, and now it's moved into all parts of the world. It takes place on Fridays, and it looks like this. This is what it looked like in Germany this past Friday. There were 100 protests on Friday all over the world in major cities. And what makes these protests new is not what's being said, but who's saying it. The protesters are children. Children who are skipping school on Fridays so they can hit the streets in their cities to protest. They're denouncing their parents and their parents' generation and their grandparents' generation. And their beef is that our planet is in dire peril and older generations aren't doing anything about it.
We will change! We will change! We will change!
It's a really slow process, and that is why a lot of people think they can ignore it because, well, it'll only hit us in a couple of decades or maybe in centuries, but we have to act right now if we want to prevent a disaster.
We have a right to breathe, and here we are not getting because of the pollution increasing day by day.
We are striking because we have done our homework and they have not.
If I wanted to skip school, I'd have better things to do than stand out here in the cold. It's important for us to go on strike to show politicians that it's pointless to go to class if we have no future.
And if you still say that we are wasting valuable lesson time, then let me remind you that our political leaders have wasted decades through denial and inaction.
It's a hard-hitting message. And it started with a girl in Sweden, Greta Thunberg, who in September skipped 3 weeks of school and just sat on the front steps of Swedish Parliament, wrapped up in a blanket, and she was handing out flyers to anybody who stopped by. And she got a lot of grief, why aren't you in school? And she said, well, why aren't you doing your job? And that inspired these protests. And this past Thursday, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So this isn't going away. This protest is going to continue. What the kids are saying, of course, is not new. The latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has predicted that if drastic action is not taken in the next 12 years, the Earth our children inherit will be a hot, pale shadow of the world which we've enjoyed. In the lifetime of our teenagers, nations near the equator will become uninhabitable if we don't do anything different. This will spark mass exoduses that will make the Syrian exodus problem tiny. And we've seen how much that destabilized Europe, and how much the small trickle of people from Central America has been destabilized in the United States. Well, take that and put 30 million people on the move, and you get a sense of what lies ahead. Virtually all coral reefs will be destroyed before 2100. Cities like New York and Miami will be flooded, and it won't make any sense to ever go to Florida for a holiday because it's just going to be too hot. That's going to happen while most of us are alive. No one wants massive crop failures, droughts, and unending refugees crises, of course. So why haven't we demanded more action from our governments? In this case, the cross that we're avoiding is not the death of the earth, but the death of our lifestyle. We don't want to give up our cars, our houses, or our trips. We don't want to change that in any way. So instead of accepting that we must change, our society has turned its back on the hard choices that must be made. And that's what the kids are calling us out of. And I don't think I have to remind you of President Trump's attitude towards climate change or Premier Ford's. The governments that we're dealing with right now are, if anything, going backwards, not forwards on this issue. One way or another, this is a cross that we will have to face and carry. Chemistry, physics, and biology don't care if we're nice people or mean people, Christians or Muslims. They don't care if we're old or young. This is just going to happen unless we try to change it. But how do we find the strength to overcome our fear and reticence? Well, today is St. Patrick's Day, and his story may actually be able to help us. St. Patrick is the patron saint of Ireland. And on this day, in cities all over the world, this is from Chicago, rivers will run green, and people are going to do a whole lot of drinking in honor of St. Patrick. People will read poetry, and they're going to have a lot of fun. But it's easy to forget, actually, that for most of St. Patrick's life, he really, really hated the Irish. The real St. Patrick was not a big fan of the Irish. He grew up in the late 300s, early 400s in Roman Britain, Western Britain. At that time, it had troops, Roman troops in it, protecting it, making it part of the Roman Empire. But in the year 410, the Visigoths descended on Rome and sacked Rome, and so the troops were called home to try and defend the Roman Empire from the Germanic tribes which were attacking, which left the place where Patrick was living in the western part of England, in the south, exposed. And at the age of 16, Irish raiders came across from Ireland, came to his village, slaughtered the servants in his house in front of him, grabbed him, as well as thousands of others, put them on pirate ships, and took him back to Ireland. And for the next 6 years, he was stuck in Ireland as a slave, enslaved, tending to sheep outside, never knowing if he was going to get back to his parents, not knowing if his parents were even alive, just knowing that he really hated the Irish for what they had done to him. So, in Ireland, he was a shepherd, and not knowing where to turn, he turned to God. And he says in his autobiography that he prayed to God hundreds of times a day and night. And he slowly felt the presence of God. And after 6 years, one night he had a dream. He was told in the dream, there's a ship waiting for you. Go. The ship was 200 miles away, so he ran away from his master. Now, of course, a fugitive on the run. He was caught and killed. He finally got to the ship, and after some backing and forthing, he got on the ship, and he was able to escape Ireland. Phew. Took him a few years to get back to his home village, where he saw his parents, and of course he felt he was finally free. Except that God had other ideas. Once again he had a dream, and this time he had a dream of a man called Victoria who walked up with a whole bunch of letters in his hands. And Patrick understood in the dream that these letters were the voice of the Irish. And what they said was, "We beg you, holy boy, to come and walk again among us." Go back? Are you kidding? They want to kill me there. I hated it there. I don't want to go back. Patrick had been presented with his cross. Go back to the place where you're pretty sure you're going to die. Be killed a terrible death, either as a Christian martyr for bringing in the Christian faith, or as an escaped slave. So what did Patrick do? He did what most of us did. He didn't go back. For 14 years he avoided it. There's some debate about where he was, whether he lived in Britain or in what is now France, but it looks like he ended up living in a monastery, in one of those two places, where he finally got a decent education in Latin, how to read Latin, and he was never very good at it. He learned how to read Latin, read the scriptures, he learned about theology, and he learned about what it was like to be a monk. But still, when God tells you to do something, right, it's hard to avoid it. It's something that rattles around in the back of your head. He didn't want to face this cross, but after 14 years, he finally did. The Pope sent a bishop to Ireland who died within a year. Another reason not to go, right? But Patrick realized, no, this is what God wants me to do. So Patrick finally went. He volunteered, he was named bishop, and sent back with a posse of missionaries to Ireland to face a people who would certainly want his head. Patrick returned because he found strength through his faith. Christ invites us to take up his cross and to follow him. It sounds like a suicide mission, but it's not. This is not the path to oblivion. For Christ assures his followers that when he dies, he'll also be raised 3 days later. The cross is hard, it's heavy, it's the last thing you want to face, but it doesn't have the last word. We're not cross people as Christians, we're resurrection people. We don't stop at Good Friday. We worship and celebrate on Easter Sunday. Christ showed us that when we embrace the things that scare us most, that's when God will help us with miracles. And of course, a miracle is the thing you can't expect. It really is like a walk into the dark. If you go, oh, well, this will all work out fine, then that's not a miracle, that's just a prediction. It's when you go, okay, this terrifies me, but I'm going to do it anyway. Please, God, help me. That's when the interesting things start to happen. Christ's death was not the last word, but the beginning of a salvation that embraced the entire world. Our crosses will not defeat us if we face them. What we fear most can be the agent of our transformation if we trust in God. For Patrick, Ireland, his cross, became a blessing beyond his wildest imagination. Ireland in his time was sort of like a small version of Game of Thrones. There were about 100 competing kingdoms, constantly at war with each other, and war back then meant you would kill people, but you would also take prisoners and enslave them. So there were hostages and slaves all over the place due to this constant bun fight of competition between all these kingdoms. So when Patrick arrived with this message of peace, where he said, you know what, your status in the world isn't defined by which tribe you belong to, or whether you're winning or losing. It's defined by your love of God and your ability to share that love. People said, that sounds pretty good. That sounds better than our lives with prisoners, slaves, and human sacrifices. And so the strangest thing happened. Patrick walked through Northern Ireland, not the province, but the northern part of the Isle of Ireland, and he was able to create one monastery after another. People actually liked the idea of living a simpler life, where they would just pray a lot and be with others in a loving community and not go to war with each other anymore. Legend has it that Patrick was able to convert all of Ireland in 30 years. It's of course an exaggeration, but it gives you a sense of the massive transformation which occurred. This is a picture of a 6th century monastery. These dot all the way through Ireland. The cross which he avoided for so long turned out to be a blessing and a turning point for the entire nation. He thought by going to Ireland it would just end in his death, as it had the bishop before his. But instead, an entire nation was turned around. And that nation became a blessing for the entire world. Because, oddly, because Ireland was never conquered by the Roman Empire, German tribes who were marauding what is now France and Germany and Spain never bothered with Ireland. So as the monasteries were set up and people learned to read and write in Latin, they imported books about Rome, they imported Greek books, they ended up building these massive libraries in Ireland that were never sacked, were never burned by the Vandals and the Visigoths, while the libraries of Europe were burned. So when the dust settled during the Dark Ages in Europe, it was the Irish who reintroduced literacy to mainland Europe. There have been books written about this. One of them is simply called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And it's not an exaggeration. All this because one man decided to face his cross and do the last thing he wanted to do. He faced his fears and he went there. And God then took over and made the miracles happen. Our children have come to us with a message, begging for our help. They need us to pick up our cross and walk into the future with them. They know that our lifestyles have to change. That scares us, but as Patrick learned, if we act in faith, God can make even the greatest sacrifice into a blessing beyond our imaginings. The new society we must create to meet the challenges of climate change can be a time of hope and resurrection. We can't see the future clearly, but our faith assures us that if we act with love and courage, God will help us every step of the way. One day, our children may look back and thank us for what we do now. Because we listened, we cared, and we loved with God's hope. God's help. So, my question for you is, have you had experiences of things which you really, really didn't want to face, but when you did, it helped? Or, if that's not where you're at, what are the sorts of things in your lives which you wish you could face, but you're having trouble facing? You wish God could help you with?
Just struck by the fact that I'm trying to turn my mind to your questions, but all I can think about is how helpless I feel in terms of the environment. And my brain keeps running through, as it always does, what can one person do? And I just wonder whether I'm a journalist, I do lots of research, I still don't really know the answer of what to tell youth that, oh yeah, there is a plan. So what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Well, there are plans for how to deal with this, but our politicians haven't really wanted to do. The Paris Accord, which was signed by Canada and most of the Western nations, isn't actually, unfortunately, hard enough for us to avoid the situation which the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is saying that we're facing. I think what we need to do, frankly, is to push our governments much harder. Like tell Ford and Trudeau and every level of government that this matters to us. The reason they can backpedal on these things is because they assume nobody wants to change. It's not going to get them reelected. And that's the trick, right? I mean, Ford basically got elected saying, I'm going to make sure that gas stays cheap at the pumps. And he's going to challenge in court the carbon tax, which is supposed to come in from the federal government. We need to push back and say, no, actually, we care about this. Don't worry, you'll get reelected even if you do some of the hard things, if we care about it.
Yes, you ask, would you fix it?
You ask, what can one person do? Well, this person, when she's offered something that's plastic, like a plastic bag or a straw or the lid to a coffee cup, I say, no, I don't need it. And then I say, do you know how long it will take for this plastic to break down? And people are shocked at the answer, which I understand is 400 years. And I say to them, when my grandchildren's grandchildren are alive, this thing will just be disintegrated.
To build on that, I mean, I think there's a lot of things happening. Karen and I were talking earlier, but, electric vehicles, for example, or all these electric plug-ins you can buy. So these are just coming to market, and Volkswagen just announced they're going to lay off 7,500 people in Germany because electric vehicles are a lot easier to make than the gas vehicles. So, as that technology moves forward, a friend of mine went to VW, which only gets 150 kilometers range, but he felt, we have to step up and do something to buy these things, people that can afford it. Maybe some people can, some people can't, but if you can, to at least help with the technology to move forward. And here in Europe is really moving, and China's very moving into these electric vehicles. Little things like, whether it's plastic straws, you can buy an electric lawnmower now, a plug-in or a battery. So, there's some questions on whether battery is good or not, but it's on fossil fuels. So I think I think if everybody just did one little thing, none of us can change the world like that young woman we were speaking of. But if we just manage the plastic and try to buy something that's less fossil fuel and things like that, maybe it'll make a difference.
I think one of the challenges with this is that individual action is necessary. It's like we need to build a virtuous circle, right? Where we do good things, which encourages the governments to put into laws which will kind of force us to do even better things and on a larger scale. Because of course, we as individuals can't change the technology at the top of smokestacks. That's not something we're going to be able to do at the local Sobeys and laws. But that kind of thing has to happen too. So it needs to be a combination of personal acts as well as collective acts. Making it basically, all the signs points in the same direction. We need to make it way, way harder to get carbon into the air. In a capitalist economy, that usually means making that more expensive. So people will find other ways to do it. They'll want to drive electric because gasoline has become so expensive that it just doesn't make sense to drive a gasoline car. And that sort of thing is hard to expect individuals to do. And individuals probably will not opt out of buying gasoline voluntarily. It'll be easier if it just becomes too expensive. So we need to communicate to our government, we trust you to make things hard on us and we won't hold it against you. And that generally hasn't been the way democracy works. But one of the people who I saw speak when I was doing research for this said, in the years before World War I, the countries got together and had conference after conference after conference, and then they still sent a generation to their deaths. And he was saying, that's what this is. This is our World War